Professor Katharine Mach, thanks so much for joining us. Let's start by talking about your field. What is your field of research?
So I'm broadly interested in how knowledge interfaces with decisions. And if I were to describe my field of research, it's really integrative assessment of climate change risks and options. And as a field, that's inherently interdisciplinary, but it's basically saying there are many complex problems relevant to societies in real term, where we have lots of different lines of evidence that can be integrated to provide a depiction of the state of knowledge. And oftentimes those evaluations of what we know and what we don't are really assisted by bringing experts together with decision makers in this process of assessment. So another way of thinking of assessment is it's synthesis science, in my case, towards climate solutions, where you have experts interacting with decision makers.
And can you say what are the central questions that your field tackles within that topic concerning decision making and uncertainty? So
I feel like to answer that question, it's in some ways helpful to step back and say, where do we see assessment happening? And as an academic, I can be interested in the science of assessment, but assessment is contingent on practices that are happening out there in different bodies and convenings. So for climate change, the longest running body that has looked at climate change assessment at the global scale has been the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. There, at the same time, are many different national level assessments of climate change, even city scale assessments, assessments that bridge the private and the public sector. So across all of those, if there really is this question of, well, what are the most central questions and what have the advances been? At the global scale, it's spanned the gamut. Is climate change happening? Once there was evidence that this is unequivocal warming due to our emissions of heat-trapping gases, the central questions became, well, what are the risks from our emissions of heat-trapping gases? What are those risks for people and communities around the world? And simultaneously to that, there's the next question of, well, what are our options for response, both in terms of increasing resilience and preparedness for the impacts, but also reducing our emissions of heat-trapping gases. And then finally, now that we're in this era of climate solutions where responses are happening across the continents in different ways, and we see momentum building, it's how do we learn and adjust in real time and make responses happen a lot faster than they are at present.
Can you talk about the particular methods or techniques developed to address these questions?
In particular, kind of in the realm of deep uncertainty, or?
Yes, yeah.
So I think of there being 4 pillars in this space of assessing climate change risks and options that are particularly interesting, and they're particularly relevant, especially when you've got deep uncertainties that will be persistent and contested priorities relevant to the decision-making context. So priority number 1 that I really like to think about is the fact that good climate change assessment, getting at what we know and what we don't, has to integrate different lines of evidence. And that can be incredibly challenging. So, you can say in a stylized way that it involves integrating results that are quantitative, numerical projections out of models, with understanding that's a lot more qualitative from different lines of inquiry, but also just informal expert knowledge. So when you have your best available projections of possible futures, and then you need to use them to inform decision-making, the question becomes, what about all the processes not in those models? What about the limits? So integrating evidence is that first priority, and it's really challenging. A second priority in assessment is how you apply expert judgment in bringing together different lines of evidence. And they're really fascinating extended disciplines that are devoted to how do we think about judgment, what's subjective, how can you elicit that person by person, how can you tap group convenings. But applying rigorous expert judgment in many ways is the challenge and the opportunity of assessment, and it's something that happens individually and in groups. A third big part of climate change assessment is how we unfold possible futures and how they link to our current decisions and actions. As we've been hearing about in many ways at this workshop, the traditional model is predict, then act. You spell out, for example, on climate change, a few global scale futures of what happens if we continue with high emissions of heat-trapping gases as compared to really ambitiously reining in our emissions of heat-trapping gases. Those are helpful for organizing research communities, but they're not necessarily very effective at getting at what information people need to make good decisions. And so you can think about other scenario approaches, much more flexible in terms of evaluating extreme possibilities and possible futures, scenarios that start with decisions and worlds in which goals are met versus missed, and also scenario-based approaches that are much more interactive, not just a scientific projection that is then passed out into the world, but something that brings experts and decision makers together. And the final fourth pillar is really thinking about those expert decision maker stakeholder interactions in processes of assessment to build shared knowledge of what questions are relevant to choices about how we decarbonize our economy or how we prepare for risks in coastal areas that are flooding. And then how to kind of, in an interactive, iterative way, shape understanding of the state of knowledge towards those decision-relevant questions.
Are there any particular notable findings that you'd like to highlight that have come out of those approaches, those pillars?
Maybe just I'll use a few examples of ways they've worked, ways they've been challenged, and kind of some of the trade-offs around them. So one classic example of the challenge of assessment is understanding how much sea level rise might happen in the relatively near term. So say within the next decades to century. In a bit of an irony, it can be easier to say how much sea level rise might happen 1,000 or 2,000 years from now, because we have lots of lines of evidence that get at what has happened between ice ages on planet Earth. It's actually much harder to say how rapidly might the seas rise given our emissions of heat-trapping gases at their current rates, and in particular given the gross uncertainties about the stability of the West Antarctic, which holds many meters of sea level rise equivalent in it. And so in terms of how climate change assessment has operated in the past, it has often been looking heavily at the best available process-based models that give numerical projections into the future, and then really grappling with what do we do with the deeper but still pretty technical uncertainties of how the processes that we can't model, that we know are at play in the ice sheets on the planet, might come into play in shaping how much sea level rise happens in this century. So that would be kind of very much a physical risk challenge where it's about integrating evidence, applying expert judgment, understanding possible futures, and we see clear ways that has worked and also ways it's been challenged as knowledge has been rapidly evolving over the last few decades. Maybe I'll just give one more example at the other extreme of the assessment space, which is how do we think about mitigation trajectories of emissions at the global scale, mostly of carbon dioxide, but also of all the other heat-trapping gases, and what those trajectories might look like to meet different goals at the global scale for temperature increase. So we've got the Paris Agreement right now with its goal of keeping warming well below 2 degrees Celsius. The world has already reached 1 degree Celsius. If we say, well, our carbon budget for 2 degrees Celsius is about 3 trillion tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and we've already emitted 2 trillion tons, we are 2/3 of the way through that budget, and that's about 20 more years at current levels of emissions. So this is a small and rapidly dwindling budget of how much more heat-trapping gases we can put into the atmosphere. And these models are trying to figure out, well, what would be a smart pathway through the century, recognizing that a smart pathway, a cost-effective pathway in terms of how these models actually work, would ideally require knowing technology costs in year 2100 or knowing what the global GDP will be in 2100. Those are essentially unknowable things. They're ambiguous at the global scale. But the challenge of assessment is saying our best available numerical model estimates are having to take into consideration those things that are absolutely unknowable, in the same time that the structure of the Paris Agreement is being defined around these best available estimates.
So let's turn now to the normative question of how uncertainty, potentially severe uncertainty, should guide decision making or be reflected in it. So given all of the approaches to assessment that you've been talking about, once assessments are made, what does your field think about how those should be used in decision making?
So, as we've discussed, climate change assessment, whether it's the Intergovernmental Panel on climate change or national assessments or company scale assessments, are trying to provide the state of knowledge on complex decisions that will have persistent uncertainties. So then the next question is, well, how do you think about the possible influence of those assessments on decision making? And it's actually been a somewhat in-depth field of inquiry to say, how do we understand the influence of the many assessments that have happened to date? And there's about 15, 20 years ago, a rather big evaluation led out of the Harvard Kennedy School that was trying to say, how do we understand the influence of environmental assessments to date? And they kind of started with the idea that you would define an assessment of a complex problem with relevance for decision-making under uncertainty as the assessment happens, and then there's now a policy in place that hadn't been there before, or some concrete change in behavior. And what became really clear is that assessments of climate change or other environmental issues where you've got these persistent uncertainties have a much more complex interaction with decision-making and society as compared to assessment happens, world change type of model. Oftentimes, they're really just giving you an understanding, a framing of the issue so that you can put together, well, what's the basis of agreed upon facts as compared to the normative dissent. And that can be a major advance of assessment to say, here's the state of knowledge, and in terms of our options on the table for climate change mitigation, here are the ones that come down to choices around leadership as compared to choices around costs, as compared to taking the issue of climate change mitigation and making it into a business opportunity. Or some other decision makers might say, well, our entry point to the state of knowledge is actually going to be more about the co-benefits, the way that climate change mitigation affects everything else that the society is trying to achieve. So I would say that the major advances in this space have been recognizing that informing decisions under severe uncertainty are often about separating understanding that's more objective as compared to how that understanding interfaces with different goals so that people can hope to parse the complexities moving forward.
So is the idea that your field just does the assessment, but with an understanding of the various ways that that assessment can influence the world and influence decision making? Or is it also that your field has something to contribute to those decision-making processes as well? Or do you sort of stop at the assessment?
Great question. So a good assessment is as much about the process of assessment as compared to the products. And a good process brings experts in interaction with decision makers from square one. So at the very start of the conversation, Rob Lempert this morning spoke about the importance of convening power. So why are people coming together? Do they have a reason to be in interaction around a given decision? So for example, the IPCC has interacted with the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change because it is in many ways the ultimate body of how we're going to come up with a global treaty to address climate change. There are many other ways that happens. So in my California context, for example, there is very high ambition at the state level of coming up with a strategy for deep decarbonization and achieving it over the next decade and two. And therefore, they're very heavily looking for using interactions between experts and decision makers in that state scale to come up with a basis of knowledge upon which they can develop policy. So at the very start, you're saying, well, what are the rules of this assessment process? And the process will be effective if those rules are agreed upon by decision makers coming together with some clear convening power of why they're together, and experts understanding those rules. Through the process of assessment, that interaction between experts and decision makers first of all starts around what questions can be addressed in this assessment process, what information do decision makers need, and how can you think about how that interfaces with different lines of evidence available. Oftentimes, decision makers or stakeholders, more broadly defined, will provide inputs on the developing assessment, whether it's a report or a presentation of evidence in different forms, as it's being developed, really indicating, is it useful? Is it getting at the basis of evidence and knowledge they're aware of? And then at the end, if an assessment has worked well, in many cases that conclusion of the product of an assessment, a report or a database, is just the beginning, and the assessment becomes a basis for sustained dialogue through time that can inform that process of learning that's inherent to virtually any decision or policy process around climate change risks and options.
On the basis of your research and experiences, what do you want to add to that general view of your field that you've talked about so far?
There are two areas that I'm really prioritizing in my research on assessment, really trying to advance the science of assessment through trying new things and evaluating them in real time. So one that I've been focusing on very heavily is this integration of quantitative and qualitative evidence. That's kind of the stylized way of saying that we've got numerical model-based results, we've got case studies, mixed method approaches, and in assessment, we're trying to bring them together. As a specific example there, the project that I'm now launching through an assessment initiative at Stanford is looking at the linkages between climate change and violent conflict. And it's a bit of a challenging field in that if you take more quantitative approaches through essentially statistical approaches drawing from econometrics, you can see in some cases strong linkages between weather deviation, a really hot decade or a really dry year, and an increased likelihood of violent conflict breaking out. In some approaches, statistically, you can see that linkage that it exists. In others, you see that it's not there necessarily at all times. And then if you jump to understanding process through more qualitative or case study-based approaches, putting all of those different lines of evidence together is incredibly challenging because it ranges from climate change potentially has a very large effect on outbreaks of violent conflict, all the way through to everything else seems to be way more important, and it's hard to potentially even point to any impact of climate change on violent conflict. So integrating quantitative and qualitative evidence in that kind of a circumstance is as hard as assessment gets, and it's a place where I actually think there's big opportunity for advancing our approaches to assessment. And the second thing that I'll emphasize is actually kind of related to what needs to advance from my perspective. And I think what often happens in different climate change assessments is that you bring experts together, you put them around the table, and you assume that rationality just magically emerges, that you have transparent revealing of top insights in a group process. But actually what happens when you bring experts together is sometimes a magnification of the types of biases we all are prone to in making judgments. We'll be more likely to anchor on what someone just said as compared to starting from an open-minded blank slate. So if someone says the value 10, you're more likely to think 11. If someone says the value 1,000, you're more likely to think 1,001. Those types of dynamics get amplified in group deliberations so that they often are both overconfident and conservative. And in something like violent conflict, where different research approaches give you really different answers, bringing people together right off the bat often leads to a whole lot of disagreement and missed opportunities for using some of the methods that exist to get at individual expert perspectives, so for example, through expert elicitation, and then combining that with the benefits that can happen around a more open-ended discussion among groups of experts.
So regarding improving the integration of different lines of evidence, is it your idea that within scientific committees like IPCC author groups, that the big place where there's room for improvement is in the human organization of the group and how people are interacting, as opposed to some new sort of technical statistical techniques or something for combining lines?
So I think on the one hand, I absolutely agree that just assuming that group interactions happen automatically and produce the best outcome is really counterproductive, and that it's actually important to be more structured in both formal and informal ways in terms of how experts interact. But even from a more technical perspective, I do think that there are a lot of missed opportunities in integrating evidence. So oftentimes people coming together to think about climate change have a natural type 1 error aversion in terms of how they've been trained as scientists. They're much more comfortable, if they're not really sure a number is right, basically saying that we're not totally sure if there's an effect. It's culturally defined approach to interpreting evidence and reporting findings and assessment processes. However, as part of that, there can actually be a much greater structuring in a technical sense of how you think about for sea level rise. What are all the key influences on how much sea level rise happens? Ranging from when water heats up, it expands, that's happening in a changing climate, through to these dynamical processes of how ice sheets flow and collapse. So there can be more deliberate attention to, within assessment, structured treatment of what are all of the influences on a given risk at hand or option being considered, and how do you understand the nature of uncertainties across them, recognizing that if you aren't really deliberate about thinking about influences and uncertainties, you're likely to discount a lot of the deeper uncertainties in particular, and essentially just leave them out in terms of the risk analysis or assessment that you present in the end.
Considering the sorts of high-stakes, radical uncertainty decisions that we've been talking about, suppose you're asked for general practical advice on how these uncertainties should be dealt with in the decision-making process. What do you think are the most important messages you would want to get across?
Maybe use two examples of general practical advice where I've been at this interface of an assessment happening in real time or just being brought to completion, and there being decisions that are taken. So one was at the global scale. So following the 5th assessment report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that came out in 2014, there was in real time interaction with the Paris Agreement that was being negotiated at that time. And there is a request from the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the group that essentially is leading international climate policy negotiations, to have what was called a structured expert dialogue, where it was actually over the course of 2 years, experts came together with decision makers, where the decision makers were the parties to the International Climate Treaty, and the experts were largely from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, having participated in that assessment, but also from other contexts. And the discussion was focused on what should the long-term global goal be for the Paris Agreement, in essence. Should it be well below 2 degrees Celsius or 1.5? How do you think about how adaptation to climate change, preparing for impacts and risks, should come into that? How do you think about the architecture in which adaptation mitigation linked together with sustainable development as a whole? And so the key thing there was that it was a dialogue. It was open-ended. It wasn't something where there was an answer that was provided to decision makers. It was strongly recognized that when Trinidad and Tobago versus Saudi Arabia had questions on the evidence, they wanted to explore, what does this mean for small island nations that are particularly vulnerable to sea level rise in a changing climate with substantial risks that could be locked in from warming of 2 degrees Celsius unfolding over centuries to millennia, as compared to how we think about stranded assets and what that means for fossil fuel exporting nations. So that was something where the key aspect was an emphasis on dialogue, and there not necessarily being a right scientific answer, but there being different ways that the state of knowledge interfaces with the choices on the table. One more example that I'll give in terms of how decision-making intersects relates to work we're now doing with the state of California. So California has on the table a goal to reduce its emissions by 40% by 2030. This is decarbonization very similar to what Europe is aiming to achieve as a whole in terms of its pledges put forward under the Paris Agreement, and that plays out differently country by country. But that's deep decarbonization with the dive really starting to happen, not just our emissions incrementing up and up and up or slowly drifting down, but a substantial decrease over a decade timeframe in essence. And there is not only dialogue, it's also figuring out how will learning happen through time. The fact that we can evaluate the risks, we can evaluate our options and responding to them. But as implementation starts to happen and decisions are translated into action on the ground, assessment really has a new mandate to rise up to, which is how do you inform processes of learning through time, recognizing that we have no ability to say exactly how prices will drop over a multi-decadal time frame, or which technologies will end up being the winners.
So moving on to the future, in your view, what are the central challenges for the development of a proper account of how uncertainty should be incorporated into the decision-making that is appropriate for guiding the sorts of decisions you've been talking about?
Great. So I think those priorities I started with in many ways are a nice orientation of, I do think that in grappling with deep uncertainty, we're going to need to rely on the best available evidence that is drawing from multiple disciplines, where we're never going to be able to quantify all of the relevant uncertainties, and assessment works best if it's most able to tap the strengths of inference across different lines of evidence and piece those together as a whole, as compared to pretending that any one given mode of inquiry could possibly give us the full picture. I think also this question of where there is deep uncertainty scientifically and in terms of our assessment processes, we have tended to be in this predict then act type of space where we put forward our best analyses of global scale climate change scenarios, for example, and then just assume that those decision-making ripples that are way downstream and that are quite weak will somehow be picked up. I think the opportunity moving forward is to flip some of that and to say where there are deep, severe uncertainties, even at assessment that's pretty global scale or big picture, how can we start to think about the goals the world's people want, that they might want to produce or achieve or aspire towards as compared to the worlds that they might get? How do we start with some of those kind of values and goals up front and use that to think about the space of deep uncertainties as compared to clinging to this idea that we have to report the right scientific answer, even if it's irrelevant to the decisions being made?
So regarding these challenges, do you think that there are contributions from other fields and other actors needed beyond your field?
I think in many ways the challenge of climate change is that it kind of wraps its arms around the entirety of the human experience. So it's not just how do we think about decarbonizing our energy system, but when it comes to the impacts of climate change, its impacts on water and nature and coastal systems and cities and rural areas, its livelihoods and poverty at the same time that it's the global economy as a whole that is affected. And what has happened to date for climate change assessment is that it has tended to tap individual topical disciplines, topical experts in silos, and said, how do we understand risks for nature in a changing climate, or risks that are really about our best projections of global food security. Moving into the future, I think a lot of the response space tends to be, or essentially tends to need to be very interdisciplinary to get it right. So if we're going to manage risks for a coastal area, yes, that's physical understanding of how much sea level rise might happen, but it's also understanding of the potential for different response options ever happening out there in the world, where people might want to put up seawalls in some cases. In other cases, they might want to retreat from that coastline, even though the word retreat is deeply uncomfortable in many decision-making contexts and really something that is just starting to come onto the radar. So getting towards assessment that speaks to solutions, whether it's adaptation or mitigation, requires a level of interdisciplinary approaches that we really have not yet seen in the climate change space, even though it has informally happened. And it's also a type of space where we have to recognize that we need generalist experts, not just deep dive topical experts. We need experts who are attuned to what it means to bring together different lines of evidence towards decision making, drawing from approaches that are informed by engineering and economics and public policy and government.
Katharine Mach, thank you for joining us.